clear attempt from the part of the budget exercise to tell to the people that, don't expect any relief, don't expect any support in your times of distress. Time that the budget is literally written with the FTA in mind, and what followed thereafter is the US deal. And it's like the short shelf life that Swadeshi had in rhetoric for about last 7-8 months, it's over.
This time, one thing Finance Minister was very keen to talk about in her speech was one promise that she has kept, which was on curtailing fiscal deficit.
I think this whole idea of cutting fiscal deficit has now become a farce. It simply is an expenditure cutting scheme to penalize the people, to basically put them in disadvantage.
From this whole budget, if you look at it, the people are missing. Every year earlier, they used to, when in the budget speech, they used to always give the allocation that is for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But since the last, I think, 3 budgets, they have completely stopped even mentioning it. Their priority is mostly on, of course, industrialization, etc., and all the other perks that he's talking about, foreign travel or whatever.
In India is on rising household debt. I think in March of last year, it had gone up to a little bit above 41% of GDP. Have you seen the government doing something in the budget or even otherwise to try and address this issue?
It shows a sign of distress in the economy. The banks are doing great, but people are not, and the write-offs largely go to the big corporates, and the people are left at large. And nothing comes in the budget that even faintly acknowledges this. We ought to expect that the budget would respond to this, but sadly, none of that happened.
Budget basically is a clear reflection. You don't have to look at the calendar, election calendar, as to when the election is. So last year, Makhana was the flavor. The reality is that the government allocated only 100 crore for Makhana, and they spent 30 crore rupees on that. But the budget was all about how this is the magic thing. This year it was coconut, because Pondicherry, Tamil Nadu and Kerala are going for elections.
The finance minister has said no tariffs on industrial imports, be it in pharmaceuticals, be it in heavy machinery, and all of that is open to the EU right now. No customs, and most of the things have been cut down in imports.
Hello and welcome to The Wire. I am Jahnavi. Today we are having a special discussion on the state of India's economy today and going forward. It's been 10 days now since Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented this year's budget. Also of late, the government has been celebrating the trade deals it's been making with the UK, with the EU, and most recently with the US. With me to talk about all of this today, I have 3 very special guests. Himanshu teaches economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Beena Pallical is with the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. And Anirban Bhattacharya works with the Center for Financial Accountability. Thank you all so much for being here today. Anirban, I want to start with you. And broadly, we've seen a lot of headlines of late. So I want to spend the next half an hour or so talking about not just the numbers that we've been seeing, but the stories behind these numbers, what it means for people's daily lives. So to start with, the budget announcements and then also the deals we've been seeing, especially the US deal. What are your big takeaways from the last couple of weeks?
Right, thanks for having us in the show. I'll just talk about 3 main takeaways at this point in time. It's already been 10 days and things are still unfolding. I think the first thing that I see in this one is there's a clear attempt from the part of the budget exercise to tell to the people that, don't expect any relief, don't expect any support in your times of distress. It is the time for the people to endure right now. The world is in turmoil, there are a lot of uncertainties, and people need to endure. And it kind of flows very easily from the economic survey. In fact, dovetails it, because the economic survey very interestingly ends on this note that, this is the time for endurance. You need not look for, basically you have to prioritize Shreya, which is long-term endurance, over prayer, which is like quick comfort. So in this exercise, what it is trying to say is that, of course, the finance minister in the budget speaks of kartavyas. But it is very easy to see that over here actually the kartavya is on the part of the citizens. It is their duty right now to not look for fleeting comforts, not look for prayer, and put Shreya above. And in that, it's basically kind of goes really well with the ideological core of this regime, which is that you need to perform your fundamental duties. You need not speak about rights, and that's where the kartavya is actually for the people. What is the government's kartavya in the budget? The finance minister, say for instance, speaks about simplifying baggage allowance for foreign travel, making foreign trips cheaper, foreign personal imports cheaper. Corporate tax anyways has been less, making it even further less by tweaking with the MAT taxes and all of this. So clearly the budget makes it evident where its kartavya lies. Now, one thing that you mentioned is that it is very important at this point of time that the budget is literally written with the FTA in mind, and what followed thereafter is the US deal. And it's like the short shelf life that Swadeshi had in rhetoric for about last 7-8 months, it's over. And I really feel bad for the core supporters of this regime, because initially they danced to the tune of ab ki baar Trump sarkar and all of that. Then suddenly tariff wars, they were hit, and for about 7-8 months they were dancing to the tune of Swadeshi. घर का खाना है, घर का खरीदना है, घर का ये करना है, and all of that. And suddenly it's gone. With this budget, it practically ends this rhetoric, and the finance minister has said no tariffs on industrial imports, be it in pharmaceuticals, be it in heavy machinery, and all of that is open to the EU right now. No customs, and most of the things have been cut down in imports. And that's something that we see, like say for instance, this 20,000 crore for carbon capture. I mean, of course, if you independently, a nation decides, no, we need to invest in carbon capture, you want to put some money in it. Great. But why suddenly 20,000 crore? It dovetails the FTA with the, with the EU, because in their carbon border management mechanism, it necessitates that we have to do it. So in a sense, we are not really deciding ourselves. I mean, the most important the takeaway from the budget, I think that we have given away our sovereignty. Our things are written. I mean, it's think about the people right now. If we are talking about a situation where initially the EU arm twisted us because the tariff deals were upon us, and it said that and showing that the government said no, you cannot expect big welfare expenses and all of that. Then you need to do with cuts, and then the EU deal happens. Then the budget comes, and right after that the US deal also. I mean, basically the tariffs go away and whatever. And of course the tariffs go away is because you have accepted everything. So at the end of this, if one takes a seat back after 10 days and sees this entire episode play out, everyone is a winner except the people, because it is they who have to take the burden of all of this. Lastly, I think there is a lot of discussion that happened about the MSME. As the third takeaway that I think is that MSMEs को बहुत impetus मिला है. Of course, with the tariff distress and everything, MSMEs have been in a very precarious position, and it needed support. But one needs to figure out that this 10,000 crore SME support growth fund, it's not the usual credit guarantees that anyone can apply. It's directed towards champions who are going to help in this export thing, basically with the EU FTA in mind. So a select few people will have this equity support, and the large majority. So if one thinks about employment generation, it's not for that the entire MSME sector is going to really get a lot of benefit out of this. So in terms of employment, what we have is what? A standing committee. That's all that we have. And so I think it's largely geared towards the FTA and the deals and all of that, and we have kind of shown in this budget that we are not really thinking about us, or our people at least. So it's clearly thinking about the super rich, their trips, their taxes, but nothing for the people.
Himanshu, I wanted to ask you, around this time every year we start looking at previous budgets, what was promised, what was actually spent, and a lot of the times the headlines are around what wasn't done. But this time, one thing finance minister was very keen to talk about in her speech was one promise that she has kept, which was on curtailing fiscal deficit. I want to ask you about that. What is behind these numbers? When we have a low fiscal deficit in this particular case that we've seen in this budget, and also a low spend, who is paying the price for that?
I mean, obviously, it is the people who will pay for the price, and this is commonsensical. But I think one has to understand what a fiscal deficit basically means. In a simple terms, it is something which is that you are spending more than your revenue is, and that's not sustainable in the long run. So you have to bring it down, and you actually government did it in during the COVID time, and it was quite high, and it had to be brought down. And there are two ways of doing it. One is that you increase your revenue, because after all, we are talking about the deficit.
Yeah.
If you increase your revenue, then the deficit goes down, or you cut down on the expenditure. Now, the government for the last 3 years, actually, the strategy has been to cut down on the expenditure. And almost all of these expenditures are expenditures which are meant for people of this country, and are not the middle class or the rich. Basic living livelihood issues where the money has to be spent, and that is where the money has been cut on education, on health, on rural development, on urban development, on everything where the money has been cut. And this has happened keep that in mind, that the government's revenue actually has been in shortfall. They could not even mobilize. They had a very conservative target of mobilizing revenue. Even that they could not mobilize. So there's a huge shortfall in revenue. So on the one hand, not only did you're not able to mobilize revenue which you yourself projected in your budget, last year's budget, you cut down on the expenditure. And in that expenditure itself will have a long-term impact, because that expenditure is essential for economy's growth. And if people are not going to earn, there is going to be a setback on that. You're likely to have lesser income even next year. But this revenue shortfall, and I must point it out, has been something which has been clearly shows what Anirban was talking about, is the priorities of this government. In 2019, they gave roughly 2 lakh crore rupees of tax giveaway to the corporate sector. That we don't know how much they've stopped publishing those numbers. Must have gone up there. Last year budget, they gave the tax in terms of income tax rationalization. They basically gave a tax giveaway to the upper middle class, the section which actually pays tax, not the ones who are simply filing the returns. I'm talking about the people who are at the top 10% of the economy. And then in the middle of the year, they gave the GST in terms of GST rationalization. Majority of the taxes were cut in automobiles, for example, the big cars and all of those expenditures. So in a sense, you actually subsidized those sections. You cut back on basic expenditure for majority of the population, and this included a huge majority of the schemes. Agriculture is one good example of it. Rural development, massive shortfall. Urban development, massive shortfall. Even government's own scheme, I mean, the so-called the flagship scheme, the Jal Jeevan Mission, and those kind of schemes, almost single one of them have been cut. So I think this whole idea of cutting fiscal deficit has now become a farce. It simply is an expenditure cutting scheme to penalize the people, to basically put them in disadvantage. And I think one must also, and I'll just take one more minute to say that if you are really trying to understand, and I think we are not there's not the right time to have the discussion on budget. You ideally should have the discussion on budget 1 year later, because this government has a track record, at least for the last 3 years, that whatever number they are putting in the budget has absolutely no meaning. So they can promise the moon. I mean, they can say that we'll spend some 2 lakh crore rupees, and when you go to revised budget, you actually turn out to be 20,000 crores. So when you don't, I mean, on what basis? We are basically having this discussion based on a statement made on the floor of the parliament, passed by the parliament, that they are going to spend so much money. And you end up not spending it, then all this discussion is meaningless. And it has become a routine now. I mean, almost every year this is something which is happening, that you are underspending. So it's not just that you are cutting down the budget, you are not even spending whatever you allocated, which is what the parliament gave you a sanction that this is how much you spend. So it's a double whammy. One is that you cut down the budget, then you don't spend whatever has been cut in, and next year you put in the same numbers again. This has become like a story for this. So I think in somewhere this whole fiscal deficit obsession, which is what the market would like. I mean, obviously the market was not behaving exactly the way they wanted it to be, but it is being done in a very, very I would say in a manner which definitely will have an implications on people's lives, their livelihoods, but more importantly for the growth in the long run.
Now, speaking of unspent allocations and budgetary cuts in general, I know that the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights has been doing an annual Dalit Adivasi budget analysis. So, could you talk about your main findings from this year's analysis?
So, like Anirban said, I think from this whole budget, if you look at it, the people are missing. First of all, every year earlier, they used to, when in the budget speech, they used to always give the allocation that is for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, no? But since the last, I think, 3 budgets, they have completely stopped even mentioning it, which means that, slowly they're thinking of maybe, removing it totally. So there was no mention. In fact, we were really shocked, I think 3 years ago when we were listening to the budget speech, that the mention of it also was not there. Similarly, every year now they've continued that, which is, like he's saying, is where is their priority? Their priority is mostly on, of course, industrialization, etc., and all the other perks that he's talking about, foreign travel or whatever. So if you come down to the brass tacks of what the actual budget looks like for Dalits and Adivasis, on the whole, if you look, they're supposed to allocate 16.8% for scheduled castes, but it is 11%, and for scheduled tribes, they have allocated fully 8.5%, which is what they're supposed to allocate. So, scheduled tribes, the allocation is proportionate to the population, but that's about 196,000 crores for Dalits and 141,000 for tribals. But actually, if you sort of go in-depth analysis and you look at it, only about 75,000 is going for a targeted development for the community, which is what that they've put these huge budgets for schemes that absolutely have nothing, like for urea subsidies. It's an example, like 8,000, 9,000 crores. That is under the Dalit or the budget for the scheduled caste. But half the people don't have land. What are they going to do with urea, right? Things like roadways, for example, that has nothing to do with the community. So at the end, if you look, it's only 4.5% of the total budget that is allocated is going for the targeted schemes and development, and for the Adivasis, it's about 3.5. So the rest of all this great big amount that they've put in actually is not really, and it's very easy to find that. It's in their budget books if you look at, I mean, for the common person, like outcome budget. I mean, we know it because we look at budgets, but there are rules in each scheme. If you look, there, if it's not mentioned that it's a targeted scheme, it's very easy to say that, this is not really going to the community. So this is happening every year, but it's getting worse and worse because now they're clubbing schemes under these, under these big names like maybe Ramji or I don't know, so many like these schemes that it's difficult also to monitor this, like, clubbing schemes together and really where is this money going. So at the end of the day, I think it's really disappointing that we see that, the main principle of scheduled caste subplan and tribal subplan is that it has to go for basti development, family development, or individual schemes like scholarships. And we feel that none of those principles are kept in mind while allocating. And this is only about allocation. Utilization is another big story. Yeah.
I want to ask you also about utilization while we're on this subject, because there are sometimes also targeted schemes that are announced,
Yes.
but then slowly they seem to disappear, not just from public imagination but also from the next
Yes,
year's budget or other government paperwork. So what is the impact of that?
Just to give you an example, like manual scavenging, I mean, we have a law that we have to eliminate, they have only one scheme, which is the Namaste scheme, which is more focused on the mechanization of, of sanitation work. But all the other schemes, there was a scheme specifically for children of, women or families engaged in manual scavenging. They've removed that scheme. This was already done last year. There was a scheduled caste Finance Development Corporation. They had some money there, All that, they have totally stopped those schemes this year. So the only scheme is for mechanization in some way. So the act actually says, the Elimination of Manual Scavenging Act actually says that you have to rehabilitate and give an alternative livelihood for, if you were to remove women from this. But then if you have not allocated a budget, then it's very clearly, how are you going to rehabilitate? So that's just one example. There are several examples like this where, they have removed schemes that are very important and critical to the development of the community.
Anirban, I wanted to come back to you. One of the concerns that we've been seeing in India is on rising household debt. I think in March of last year, it had gone up to a little bit above 41% of GDP. So, A, why is this a concern? And B, have you seen the government doing something in the budget or even otherwise to try and address this issue?
So you rightly said the latest financial stability report also highlights this. This figure is in itself alarming, 41.3% of GDP for household debt. And some of the other qualifying figures as to why this debt is also equally alarming. It's not that people are borrowing to fund their business or for building economic assets. None of this. Largely it is for daily consumption needs. And that is what, underlining that is very important is it shows a sign of distress in the economy. People, and this is something that we have also been seeing on field, on ground, in surveys that we have been conducting recently. IDVA also did a nationwide survey, and all of these things are coming to fore as to what is driving this debt crisis. It's largely medical expenses, emergency health expenses, education in the sense, one has to keep in mind that all of these things increasingly have been privatized. And with that, the amount that they're having to spend on, simply like when we spoke with women in Tamil Nadu, simply to pay education fees, school fees, they're borrowing. So it's not that there's an asset creation happening which has a long-term impact in terms of lifting the family, but largely it's a scenario where there's been a proliferation of non-banking financial companies, NBFCs, MFIs, that are giving these easy access loans with usurious interest rates, which even the RBI has flagged several times, and really inhuman recovery practices, such that we are seeing it's quite rampant that we would see in the newspaper about suicides, harassments, and all of this is quite rampant. So of course, if the financial stability report or multiple such reports of the RBI, the NABARD, are showing this over the course, particularly since the pandemic, since the course of last few years, we ought to expect that the budget would respond to this. But sadly, none of that happened. We do not see allocations or thinking in terms of banking that, we need more brick and mortar branches, we need more public sector banking, we need access to affordable credit, safe credit. None of this seems to be the priority. And as Himanshu and Beena both have said, that we need to underline repeatedly the priorities of this government. So of course, banks are doing great in numbers. In that, their asset quality is great. And in the sense, there is a lot of boasting about it also. How that is accomplished through massive lakhs and crores of write-offs, that is something that is generally not spoken about. So banks are doing great, but people are not, and the write-offs largely go to the big corporates, and the people are left at large. And nothing comes in the budget that even faintly acknowledges this. What is interesting is that actually the economic survey does. The economic survey day before, in fact, tucked away carefully in a important but nonetheless in a box, not in their main analysis, underlines the fact that microfinance is causing immense cause of alarm. It's saying that there is an overexposure in the sector. It's saying that initially we thought of, that these MFI loans would be lifting the people, lifting the families, particularly. It underlines that it's largely for women, 95%, and predominantly in rural areas, and that is precisely from where the public sector banks have been retreating. It has been given away to NBFCs and MFIs, and it's the survey particularly underlines the fact that we need to no longer analyze the effectivity of these just on the terms of how many loans have you given, to how many people have you been able to reach, or how much have you been able to recover. He said, in the sense, the survey says that you can no longer kind of gauge the effectivity of this based on these. You have to right now ask whether it is lifting the families out of distress, or are they taking repeated loans for their regular expenses, because that is what the survey also finds. And in that it is saying that there is been increasingly, there is a commercial interest that is driving the entire microfinance sector, which goes by these overall numbers. And it says we need to do a qualitative assessment, because at this point of time it's not looking good. NABARD has also said that there are pockets of indebtedness. Over and over in the course of the last 3-4 years, the government has kind of celebrated this model in the name of financial inclusion. At times have here and there the RBI admonishes the NBFCs ki aise mat karo, waise mat karo, itna mat charge karo, but effectively speaking there is no cap. There is no cap on interest rate. No one can intervene. When the state governments try to intervene by making certain legislations, the RBI blocks them, saying that no, this is our prerogative, you cannot, their regulated entities are our jurisdiction, not yours. And it's effectively a quagmire of debt that people are being forced to take. With the coming of the digital interface, of course, there is proliferation of digital crimes, frauds, wo to alag hai hi. But nothing from the budget that gives any succor in this.
Now, speaking of signs of distress in the economy, Himanshu, I wanted to ask you about rural wages and how those have been stagnating, and also weak demand in rural areas. Is that a concern we should be worried about? Have you seen any steps to try and
should be
address
worried
that?
about. I mean, definitely we should be worried about. Government is worried about it.
Yes.
I mean, last year economic survey mentioned it very clearly, and the government is aware of the data. And it is now obviously clear, and it's the way our growth rates in nominal terms are going down. The economic survey may blame the private corporate sector for not investing, but they are smart people. Why would anybody be smart when there is no demand in the economy? So they are being as rational as anyone can be. The problem is with the government, who is refusing to acknowledge that there is actually a crisis in the country. It was earlier in the rural areas, and it has been in the rural areas for a long period of time. When wages have been stagnant for now almost 12 years now, almost 12 years. Longest spell that we had, that wages have been literally been flat in rural areas, both for agricultural wages as well as non-agricultural wages. And if you have this level of stagnant wages for 10 to 12 years, it's a clear-cut evidence of a deep distress in the economy. Same is the case with agriculture, where, I remember in 2016, Prime Minister announced doubling farmers' income, and the Niti Aayog came out with a working paper immediately as to how will we double the farmers' income. And so they gave a formula as to how to calculate farmers' income, because we don't calculate otherwise. You just take that formula and you find out the income today, and you find that between 2016 to 2024, farmers' income had actually real terms declined by roughly 0.6% per year. We are talking about roughly 8 years when the farmers' income decline. Farmers are not getting any income. Your wages are stagnant for the last 10 years. And the non-farm sector, the best evidence for that is that in the last 6 years, the number of people, more than 60 million people have gone back to agriculture, which is a clear evidence that the non-agricultural sector is not doing anything. It is actually as much in distress. Otherwise, why would people move from non-agricultural sector to the agricultural sector? Because the non-agricultural sector is not able to absorb jobs, not willing to provide employment, not willing to provide earnings. Therefore, everybody is now getting stuck in agriculture. So there is not a single avenue in the rural economy which is giving you any hope of income coming from. This is now worrying the government also, because now it has now spilled over to the urban areas. And so you now have a very clear-cut data that is coming out that even urban regular workers, their incomes have been negative for quite a long period of time. This is now being confirmed from multiple sources of data. Now, people have no income, then they'll not spend, and therefore there is no demand. What Anirban was talking about, that people are basically becoming more and more indebted for consumption purposes, is something which is a clear-cut evidence of it. I mean, now we are getting like hundreds of evidence. You just triangulate all of this and you'll find that people have to survive, and people are now borrowing for even basic consumption, for recharging your mobile phone, or to be paying for tuition fee, or paying for essentials that you require. So that distress is now more or less evident. Like, there is absolutely no doubt about it. And anybody who has been to the field, unless we are sitting in the AC room here, otherwise, if you go to, this is something which is so palpable. Like, talk to a farmer, they are complaining, they are not getting their prices. You talk to a wage worker, they are saying that we are not getting any, our wages have remained same, we are not able to afford anything. And you talk to anybody who is doing the so-called the small and medium enterprises, or the kirana shop, or the mechanic shop, or they are in the same situation. And I think this is something which has gone on for long. So I think the question is not whether there is distress. Question is, how long will it persist? And that we don't have an answer. At least this budget is not willing to give you any answer to what is happening on those fronts.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is the allocation of resources to states. Now, we've seen how several states have been raising this issue for some years now, that a large part of social sector spending is happening by the states, but they are not getting, the union government is not compensating them in ways that can help them do this. So, Himanshu, in this budget, do you say this allocation is fair?
One I can say that this government is actually very responsive to states, to those states which are going into elections. And so therefore our budget basically is a clear reflection. You don't have to look at the calendar, election calendar, as to when the election is. So last year Makhana was the flavor. The reality is that the government allocated only 100 crore for Makhana, and they spent 30 crore rupees on that. But the budget was all about how this is the magic thing. This year it was coconut, because Pondicherry, Tamil Nadu and Kerala are going for elections, and the allocation for the coconut board has remained the same. Not a single rupee has been allocated for that. So that's where the states come in the picture. After that, it is actually been, states have not been paid even what they were promised. You remember the states get what is called the FC grants, the Finance Commission grants. Yeah. But a large part of the money they also get from the center, which is called the centrally grant in aid for centrally sponsored schemes, the grants which is given to the centrally sponsored scheme. This year's budget allocation is actually, if you look at the last year's revised allocation, is lower than what was there in 23-24. And there is more than 1 lakh crore of shortfall in what the government promised as part of the centrally sponsored schemes and what they actually gave to the states. So states are not even getting what they have been promised. Forget about what has been promised. But what we have seen since 2016, and this is a long-term trend that we have seen happening, is that over the years, government has slowly, in some by some rule, some logic or something, and slowly been passing the burden of all these programs, all these essential expenditures to the states. This has been going on. What we saw in the VB Ramji, the Gramji bill, is something which has been happening in other schemes for earlier. We didn't create that much of a, because the scale of those programs were not very big, but it was happening over a period of time. And we see this happening here also, where the states have been asked to fend for themselves, provide that budget, in a situation where two other things have happened. And I think one has to keep that in mind. One is that since the demonetization and the GST and the distress slowdown that happened, and then the COVID happened, a large part of the burden of providing social security, providing food security, providing nutrition, providing education, health, has been being passed on to the states. They were always the large spenders. In any case, they were the ones who were taking the heavy burden. But that burden has increased now. And that burden has increased very, very significantly compared to what was there. The second factor which has contributed now a problem is that they are now got stuck in what is called the competitive populism. They have been giving this cash transfer, which is now, in some states it's like 5% of the budget, some states it's like 13% of the budget. But that's something where the states have no option. Here is somebody who comes and announces it because they have the pots of money, and they announce that we are going to give you something. And if you don't announce, this is what happened in Bihar. For example, suddenly 10,000 rupees were being given. Opposition has no other option but to compete to make it a living. Result of that has been that in most of the states, a large part of money is being given for the unconditional And that is now being reflected in states not being able to manage their basic services also. And the third one, which is now not been publicized so much, but something which is there in the fine print, is the release of the 16th Finance Commission. And that is something which is disaster. For the first time now, they have introduced a criteria for among the devolution, horizontal devolution across states, where states will be given money based on their performance. And a result of that has been that some of the better performing states, where the governance capacity is better, resources are better, the level of physical infrastructure and human capital infrastructure is much, much higher, better. Those are the ones who are going to get more money, compared to the poorer states where the governance capacity is weak, where fiscal resources are not there, physical infrastructure is not there. They are the ones where the resources have been cut. I mean, a good example is West Bengal, where more than 2,000 crore rupees will be cut this particular. So they are going to get less. Now, who are going to get more? It's Gujarat who is getting more. It's Punjab which is getting more. It's Haryana which is getting more. Whereas the states which require it, the poorer states, they are the ones which are being deprived of the resources which is necessary for their. So I think, in a sense, now the states have been, put in a box where they're unlikely to even take care of the basic governance mechanism which is necessary for them. And this budget, in a sense, has streamlined that process. But I would say this is not the first time it has happened. It has been going on for a long period of time. And I think this will have a long-term impact on, particularly this Finance Commission award is going to have a long-term impact on the level of inequality that we're going to see, with the better off states continuing to do better, whereas the what we call as the pockets of poverty, in that sense, continuing to suffer from excessive burden to take care of the necessary expenditures with lesser resources. Their ability to generate resources also has come down, their financial position has weakened, and they have to also fight with a richer and a powerful opponent in that sense. So I would say that that's something which is a disastrous outcome, unless it is reversed, unlikely to be done, because this Finance Commission is going to be there for the 5 years.
There's speaking of a potential reversal that you don't see happening, there's a final question I'd like to put to all three of you, which is that if there were 2 or 3 big changes you could make to how the economy is being handled, what would they be? Veena, if we could start with you.
So I think, we welcome the fact that every year they allocate, and the allocation keeps increasing, not because they're giving more money, but because the total, budget is increasing. And some good schemes, they're still continuing the post-metric scholarship, which I think we are demanding that it should have a higher allocation of at least 10,000 crores. At the moment, it's about 6,000 crores for Dalits, and we are demanding a little bit more. I think that it would be good if the schemes and programs which actually have a direct impact are given. So the schemes that are irrelevant, should be totally eliminated from the total budget, and that money can be reallocated for, pumping it into these schemes and programs that actually have. For example, Jal Jeevan Mission. The allocation has moved from, I think, some 8,000 odd crores to 12,000 crores. That's a big jump. But it doesn't have any specific disaggregated data to say that, it's actually going to households from the Dalit. If you are booking it in this budget head, it has to be also spent that way, which we don't see. So I think 2, 3 quick things. Another thing is the violence. This 2023 NCRB data is about 57,000, incidents of violence there. But they have clubbed the implementation of PCR and POA together with about 500 odd crores. I think there should be specific allocation only for the implementation of POA Act, because there's so much of growing violence and incidents. There should be money for special courts. Nirbhaya has some of these provisions, but they do not have provisions to ensure that, more special courts should be there in every district. One-stop centers for, for Dalit and Adivasi women who have gone through violence and atrocities. So these demands are long-standing demands. Finally, I'd like to say that continue with the programs that are really good, but put in more money, and then reallocate the programs that are absolutely irrelevant to the community. That money should also be reallocated into programs and schemes that have a direct impact on the ground.
Himanshu?
I mean, the only two things. One is that, and the issue that we talked about, the states. I mean,
Right.
remember, they are the one which are closest to the people, and they are the ones who are primary. They have the primary responsibility in our constitutional scheme of things as well. I mean, both, I mean, health, education, welfare, and everything has to be done by the state. And so, first, I think one should recognize this, and therefore, center should try and do as little as possible and pass it on to the states. I'm also saying this because the history of this country shows that most of the innovations in this country, in terms of better social sector delivery, have come from the states. It hasn't come from whether it is employment guarantee or ICDS or midday meal or women's scheme or anything you think of, or the maternity entitlement, anything you think of. The states have been able to innovate, they have been able to scale up, and that's what. So, if you give the money to the states, you are likely to have a better outcome. It will be foster some kind of a competitive welfare models that will come out to it. So, that I think is something that what we're seeing is completely opposite. That's number one. Number two, I think, is something somewhere there has to be a recognition. And I think a prescription can follow only after that. So, my point is that first you should be able to diagnose. First, you should be able to acknowledge that this country has suffered for a long period of time. I mean, the distress is no longer a invisible fact. It is not somebody's imaginary construct in that sense. And it is something which is, the longer it stays, the impact of that will be much more difficult for you to take out, in the sense it will basically persist, because a child who is malnourished, or child who is not educated, or child who is, the impact of that is not only in the current year, it is a generational impact that we are thinking. And I think we might be too late if we not ignore this. I mean, not take account of the challenges that are there in all of these dimensions. And if you keep ignoring the distress as somebody's imagination and saying that this doesn't exist, you are only fooling yourself. So I think in some ways, this is something which is going to be a big admission in that sense, but it will be open up a fair discussion, and it will lead to better allocation of resources to where it is required, rather than on fictitious targets and big ticket showmanship kind of things.
And finally, Anirban, what are the big changes you'd like to see?
2-3 things. One, I think budget needs to be more accountable. You cannot simply come to the budget stage and say that, what we are going to do with the banks, we'll put a high level committee and figure it out. What you are effectively doing by this is that you are avoiding debate, because you want to do certain things, you are outsourcing that to a committee, and you are avoiding a discussion in the parliament. What this high level committee, and this is something that's been happening, the monetization pipeline, such a huge call, was never taken in the budget or in the floor of the parliament. It was decided in the press conference. So we need to have more accountability. Second, more or less the same, an extension of that in the FTA and the US deals. People need to get a fine print of what exactly has been signed. We don't know, many of they don't know. And we are getting to know certain things from the other side, where they are saying that the agricultural sector is being opened up and we are looking forward to it and all of that. The implications of that on the farmers of this country, the implications of that, because somehow this government keeps speaking about deregulation. Even, we spoke about deregulation in 1991. In a very changed situation, the prescription is the same, more deregulation. Labor codes, of course, have come into place, being celebrated as a major reform and all of that, which basically would mean that more sweatshops, less labor rights, and competitive pricing for export markets. So we need to get the fine prints of these deals out clearly. Third is, as Himanshu was also pointing out, these people, the private sector, of course, they are not public sector. They are not going to invest because of some national interest. They are going to invest if they see profits. If they see no demand, they are not going to invest. The finance minister may keep appealing कि आप क्या हनुमान हैं, हमको कितने बार बताना पड़ेगा, and this and that. They have given corporate tax rebates. They have given all sorts of things right now, because they have not been investing in infrastructure. Now there is a infrastructure risk guarantee कि किसी भी कुछ भी तरीके से you come and invest, but they are not been doing that. And I think why they have not been doing that is because of the demand, and it needs to, I mean, I think the entire tariff war and all of that was an opportunity for this country. And economic survey recognizes that. It says that, we need to only basing ourselves on service is not going to yield. We have to build on manufacturing. What have we done about that? The budget has done exactly the opposite. So in that sense, yes, we need to work on on demand within the country, which basically means to spend on the people, spend on welfare, spend on health, education, and all of that, to have more disposable income in the hands of the people that we can buy. Its third and last is we are seeing that even like signs like what we are seeing is that the MSME sector ke andar we are seeing credit backed loans are increasing. These are signs of distress. These are not to be celebrated that formal banking, formal credit is increasing. In a small enterprise, the line between household asset and business enterprise is very thin. If people are having to put gold to get credit for that, it not necessarily mean that the business is doing great. And that is also linked to the situation of the demand in this country. You have to make policies that speak to the people, that speak to the reality of the people, and not be an ostrich, as Himanshu said, that कि हम देखेंगे ही नहीं, diagnose भी नहीं करेंगे, लेकिन prescribe कर देंगे. So
yeah, a list of several concrete steps that can be taken. I guess perhaps when we meet back next year to talk about the same budget as Himanshu said, we can see whether any of that happened. That brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all for watching.